Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. The Prime Minister has repeatedly claimed that by 2047, India will be Viksit, in other words, a high-income developed country. But now a former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council has said he's worried that India could get stuck in what's called a middle-income trap and never become a high-income country. What is that fear based upon? What does it mean for our future? And what do we need to do about it? Joining me with his answers is the former managing director of the Overseas Development Institute, Rathin Roy. Rathin Roy, in an article you wrote for the Economic Times day before yesterday, you say you are increasingly scared that India could get caught in a middle income trap and fail to become a high income developed country. You write, and I'm quoting, I have been worried that conditions of India's economic development are increasingly signaling the approach of a middle income trap. The typical fate of a middle income country is to stay there and not achieve high income status. Can you start by explaining why do you fear this might happen to India?
Thank you, Karan. I've actually been saying this, I think, including on your program since 2019. And nothing has happened since to convince me that we have done stuff that will prevent what happens to most countries in the world. Let me start by explaining that. I'm from Bombay. So and actually I grew up around Bollywood. So I often use movies as an analogy. So if you look at development as a movie, you start poor, you become somewhat developed, and you then become rich. I have to tell your viewers, regrettably, that that movie typically has a sad ending. And the happy ending movies like China, like South Korea, like France are relatively few. And the sad ending movies, already, like Brazil, Argentina, Turkey, Mexico, Egypt, and the Philippines, are typically the norm. So far, I was optimistic that India was at least had the possibility of a happy ending in this movie. What is a happy ending as opposed to a sad ending? When you're poor, everyone is by and large poor. You know, we both grew up in a poor country. You learn whether you were relatively rich or not to make do without to some extent. And you did not have aspirations to live lifestyles like those in rich countries did. As you move into middle income status, the challenge differs. People don't die of hunger anymore. They don't in India, by and large. People have basic necessities, or at least the access to them, either through subsidy or otherwise, by and large. But what also happens as a country becomes relatively rich, which is what we call moving from low to middle income status, is that people like us, the top 10 or 20% of the population, start living at standards of living that approximate those in rich countries. Now, there's a fork in that road that happens as you transform, which determines whether your movie will end as a tragedy or happily. That fork in the road is, are more and more people's prosperity increasing? Or is it that the top 20% of a population, the top quarter of a population, their prosperity goes on increasing 2 high income levels, while the rest remain mired with the basic necessities of life, but nothing more. That translates in macro terms into the difference between a high income and a middle income country. In a high income country, the majority of the population lives prosperously. And that implies a per capita income of more than $15,000 per capita. India is at $3,000. Countries like Turkey, like Brazil, like Egypt, like Philippines, their per capita income starts stagnating somewhere between $7,000 and $10,000 or $11,000 per capita. They have 20% rich people. They have 80% poor people. And they stay there in the foreseeable future, in perpetuity almost, as we have seen in the case of Brazil, 30 years now, Philippines, 30 years now, reached middle income, didn't make it to high income. What does that mean in real terms when you look at a country like that? What it means is when you go to a country like that, and I've lived in Brazil and I've seen it, it means the top 20% of the country lives extremely luxurious lives. They have the best wine possible, they have the best food possible, the best possible Medicare, they have great education, either they buy it abroad or they develop it at high prices in their own country. But 3/4 of the population lives as if they lived in a poor country, as if the country had never moved to middle income status. So all the problems that a poor country has still exists for a large proportion of the population. Poverty, malnutrition, high crime, poor education, poor healthcare, stunting. That is what is defined as a middle income trap.
And that
is the trap I'm afraid India is now moving to.
That is the trap you feel India is moving into, and that is the trap you fear India could get stuck in, because the headline of your article, and I'm holding it up for the audience, there it is, was "Stuck in the Middle Forever." And as you pointed out, there are 3 key consequences that emerge if you get stuck in the middle income track forever. First, as you said, like Egypt, Brazil, and Turkey, we will never become Viksit. We may reach per capita incomes of somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000, but we'll stop and stagnate there. Secondly, as you pointed out, 25% of Indians, that's 1/4 of the population, will enjoy prosperous lives, but the majority, that's 75%, will continue to be poor like their forefathers. But there is a third consequence, which you mentioned in the Economic Times, which I want to highlight as well. The potential for increased regional, ethnic, and gender inequality means that this could challenge what you call the unity and integrity of India. So what's at stake if we get caught in the middle income trap is not just India's dreams. They won't fructify, they won't be realized, but also possibly our survival as a country, as a united country. That too could be at stake. So the prospect of being stuck in the middle income is a dire prospect.
It is indeed. And if I may, let me explain the third point I made. Because as an Indian, that worries me the most. I've spent my life in public service trying to serve this country called India. Not Bharat, as defined by some, and not India as defined by the rich in South Bombay, but this larger country called India. The trouble with what has happened in the course of development, especially since 1991, is something that no country in the last 100 years has been able to withstand, which is the majority of the country is poor and lives in geographies that are poor. The minority of the country is rich and lives in geographies that are rich. And these geographies are almost perfectly neatly separated. Broadly speaking, peninsular India, from Gujarat to Tamil Nadu, has per capita incomes which approximate something like $3,000, $3,300. Right? That's approaching the next poorest country in the G20, which is Indonesia. But where the majority of our population lives, which I call the Great Indian Plain, which is the belt, from the Pakistan border, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, West Bengal, Bihar, and Uttar Pradesh, that region earns less than the per capita income of Nepal, which I think everyone would acknowledge is a very poor country. So in the same space, in the same nation state, you have this huge income disparity. which is exacerbated by the fact that the South, the peninsula, is where people go for employment. We call them migrant laborers, however, because when they go to the peninsula, they do not become peninsular Indians. They continue in their own country to be migrants. So labor moves, but things are not equalized because the population in the north goes down. In the Great Indian Plain, the population of the south goes up because they continue to be migrants. One. Two, capital is moving from the north and the east of India to the south, which is prosperous. That can be measured very simply by something we use called the credit deposit ratio. Let me give you an example. Let's say, let me put it this way. For every 100 rupees that Biharis deposit in banks in Bihar, which is capital, less than 70 rupees is invested in Bihar. And that is also true for UP, that is true for Madhya Pradesh, that is true for Rajasthan. For every 100 rupees that is deposited in banks in Tamil Nadu, more than 100 rupees, something like 122 rupees, is invested in Tamil Nadu. So capital is moving from the north to where there are opportunities in the south. This process is sadly fairly unique in terms of it has happened, and I'll explain that in a second. But if you look at typical countries which have rich and poor regions, take the United States. The rich regions also the high population regions. New York, Illinois, California, Texas. Take Europe as a continent. The rich populations live in the majority population areas are the rich areas, France, Germany, etc. And the relatively poor areas are Portugal, Spain, Ireland, etc. So it's easy for the rich to subsidize the majority rich to subsidize the minority poor. Even the UK, 30%, 35% of the UK lives in London and the southeast of England, which is therefore by far the majority, and about 25% live in the rest of England, I'm excluding Scotland and Wales. And therefore that area can think about subsidizing the other area. In a country like India, that is not true. And it also means that you have a tension between where the political power is and where the economic extraction and growth is happening. The only countries in the 20th century, finally, which were like us, do not exist anymore.
Absolutely.
One was the former Yugoslavia, and the other was the former Soviet Union.
I understand the nature of the tensions you're creating. India is becoming, in effect, two countries very separate to each other, where you have huge differences that could lead to tension, that could lead to, as you said, challenges to the unity and integrity of India. Let me put, however, a contrary opinion to you. How do you respond to the view that India's economic growth of 8.2%, 7% and 8.7% for the last 3 years, if it continues, should guarantee that by 2047, India becomes Viksit Bharat, as the Prime Minister has forecast? That, I assume, is the basis of the government's confidence. How do you respond to it?
Well, first, if you do the math, no country in the world has grown consistently at, first, we are not growing at 8%. Let's get that absolutely straight. We are growing at less than 8%. We haven't grown at 8% for some time now, at least 15 years. And consistent economic growth at about 8.5 to 9% year after year, every year, is what is going to give you Viksit Bharat in 2047. Now, the features I'm mentioning will inhibit that from happening because of something economists call the base effect. So if you're earning, let's say as a human being, if you're earning 2 lakh rupees a month and you want your income to grow by 10%, right? It means you need to grow from 2 lakhs to 2 lakhs 20. That is much more difficult to do than if your income is 8,000 rupees a month and you want to grow by 10%, in which case it has to grow from 8,000 to 8,800. 800 is much smaller than 20,000. So what will happen is that as the per capita income of the South goes up, if the per capita income of the Great Indian Plain does not go up commensurately, if extant conditions today continue to obtain, then it will the growth rates of the South will begin to decelerate. And if the growth rates will not remain the same, we will not grow at 8%, we will not be Viksit.
In other words, what you're saying is the belief that we will grow at 8% is fallacious on two grounds. A, we haven't grown at 8%, as you began by saying, for 15 years. We're not growing at 8% now, regardless of the figures that the statistical department puts out. And secondly, you're saying to continue to grow at 8% for another 50 years is very difficult, given the problems of the nature in which India is growing. That's why you say the belief the government has that we will inevitably become a Viksit country, a developed country by 2047 is fallacious and wrong. A quick yes or no?
Inevitability is hubris. Yes.
Okay, let's at this point then come to what I believe is the core of your argument. It's basically this. Since 1991, India's growth has been fueled by a very narrow base of people, around 150 million, consuming very specific goods. Goods such as automobiles, two wheelers, air conditioners, refrigerators, and general fast moving goods. After 30 years, you say this growth has plateaued. Secondly, you point out it's not inclusive. It's limited to roughly 10-15% of the population. Now, for people who haven't heard this argument before, who haven't read your Economic Times article, can you briefly elaborate on that for us?
Certainly. When in 1991 I was 24 years old, I could literally either buy a Maruti 800 or a Fiat or an Ambassador, one of those things. And to buy a Maruti 800 in 1991, 1990, as a lecturer in university in India, briefly, which was the same salary as the entry-level salary of an IAS officer. They become richer later, but anyway, was about 3,500 rupees a month. So broadly speaking, it would cost me 3 years' salary to buy a Maruti 800. It would cost me 10 months' salary to buy an air conditioner. Today, the entry-level salary of someone taking exactly that job is about 60,000 rupees a month. And a Maruti 800 or its equivalent, Alto or something, costs about 3.5 lakhs. So from 3 years' salary, they can now afford a Maruti 800 just 5 years. An air conditioner, they can in fact afford with less than a month's salary. And an airline ticket from Bombay to Delhi costs exactly the same as it did in 1991. So things have become much more affordable for the relatively affluent. That has fueled a massive upsurge in consumption, whether it is in air tickets or in cars or in two-wheelers or in what are called fast-moving consumer goods, fridges and the like. And this has, in no small measure, contributed to India's increased growth, increased per capita income, and increased prosperity. But that can only go on for so long. There will be so many air conditioners you will buy in your life. There are only so many airline journeys you will take in your life unless a number of people who are demanding these more prosperous things grows. So if you're confining this to the top 10 or 20%, then inevitably you're going to end up in a middle income trap, because then 75% of the population is not increasing its consumption at the same rate and pace as we have seen in our generation happening since 1991. That is the crux of the challenge that the middle income trap affords, which is why, to conclude, that when I came back to this country, I keep coming back. When I came back to work here in 2013, I went and asked Bombay economists, what are your leading indicators of the Indian economy? And they said, cars and automobiles and airline tickets. I said, but what about food? What about textiles? What about health? What about, bicycles, stuff that, not poor people, but relatively less well-off people consume? Why are they not your leading indicators? And the simple answer was they're not, because they're not what makes the economy tick. So we have to therefore transition in one of two ways. One is to make sure more people can afford cars. But in the interim, there are other things we can do, which I can elaborate on later.
You make this point very cogently in your Economic Times article. You say, and I'm quoting you, the India story since 1991 has delivered great prosperity for the top 150 million. This has reached its limits because we are unable to craft a strategy that extends this to the next 200, 300 million people. And that is why we face this danger of a middle income trap. If we can't extend it to the next 200, 300 million, we'll be stuck in a middle income trap. But if we can, we'll have a way out of it. And the way out of it is what I want to come to. You say India must focus on producing goods not just for the 150 million who are consuming, but for the 1.2 or 1.3 billion who are presently left out. And you identify 5 things which they need, which are food, textiles for clothing, an affordable house, health, and education. Explain to the audience, why would it make such a big difference if instead of cars, refrigerators, and fast-moving goods, we were to concentrate on the production of food, textiles, an affordable house, health, and education? A, why would it make a difference? And how would that ensure that the next 200, 300 million come into consumption?
Yes, that's an excellent question. You've actually hit the crux of the issue. So there are three reasons why I am advocating in the Indian context that we do not try and make sure that more people travel by air. One, because they don't have the money, and instead try and focus on things that they can consume and they can produce and earn income so that they can consume. North India is poorer than Nepal, the great Indian plain. It's also much less skilled than peninsular India. So how do I get jobs there? How do I get activities going there that can, with a marginal uplift in skills, improve employment, generate income, and therefore generate prosperity? It's not going to happen by setting up semiconductor factories. As you've seen in the papers, they will go to Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, and for politically motivated reasons, eventually to Assam, we'll see. We are not going to see large-scale manufacturing of luxury goods there because the demand is not there. So I asked myself, what does the common Indian want in their lifetime? And it struck me that what the common Indian wants in their lifetime to purchase with money in their pocket without subsidy are things that don't require large degrees of skill. They want a non-subsidized, decent, nutritious meal. That requires policy change to make sure that agriculture is a functioning business, that poor farmers and the rural sector makes money. Now, 47% of people in agriculture agree is too high. But the moment agriculture begins to make money, you will begin to release people who are in agriculture because they have nothing else to do. And where will they move? I don't want them to keep moving to the south unless the south embraces them as one of their own. They will look for jobs, ideally in their neighborhood, so they don't waste time traveling thousands of kilometers, as is currently the case, and immiserizing themselves. What kinds of jobs would they get? Well, how about clothing? That's the next thing a person wants, right? If they're poor. Not sort of poor on the breadline, but poor in the sense they earn the minimum wage. So what's happening with clothing? I want to buy a 300 rupee shirt with what I earn. Interesting, this shirt I'm wearing costs 3,000 rupees. It's entirely made in India. It's made in Tirupur and Gujarat. But the shirts that cost 300 rupees are imported from Bangladesh and Vietnam because the wages in Tirupur and Gujarat are too high to make shirts that are cheaper than 3,000 rupees. But the wages to make 300 rupee shirts are not too high in the great Indian plain. And therefore, we can move people into making this second thing that the common person wants. The third thing the common person wants is housing. There's lots of policy changes we can do, and I can go into great detail. I have elsewhere on how to do this. But broadly speaking, I don't want a house with some subsidies, as said in the article, from some avas from the Prime Minister. People are fed up of handouts from the Prime Minister or the Chief Minister, etc. I want to be like you and me. I want to earn enough money to go and take a loan, pay EMIs, and build a house for my family. That would mean loan sizes and house prices of between 5 and 12 lakhs, depending on where you live in India, in the great Indian plain. Those are simply not available. There is credit for real estate booms and Ponzi schemes. There is no credit for housing. The fourth area is education. A decent education is something that is affordable, doesn't require very high skills, and is worth investing in. We are not able to provide it. And finally, a baseline healthcare system without subsidy, which people can afford to pay for, and which delivers baseline healthcare, is something that we should be providing, but we're not providing. So all our incremental prosperity is going into air conditioners and cars and reaching away abroad into foreign holidays and foreign health and foreign education of the likes of Delhi, while these things are not being produced. And these things, if produced, will raise the incomes of the next 250 million, will raise the incomes in the geographies where I want them raised, and will therefore preserve the unity of India and give our Viksit Bharat a push. But there is a hollow and complete silence on how we do these things on a commercial, non-subsidized basis, and that needs to change.
Well, that's what I want to come to. Let's for a moment assume that the government or business are willing to do what you're saying, which is to shift the focus of their production and investment away from air conditioners, cars, two-wheelers, and refrigerators towards nutritious, affordable, good food, towards textiles for clothing, towards an affordable house for most people, if not all people, education, and health. Let's assume people are willing to do that. My question is simple. Whose responsibility is it to act to ensure this happens? Is it primarily the government's responsibility? Is it primarily the responsibility of the private sector and businessmen? Or is it a jointly shared responsibility? Who needs to take the initiative?
That's a very complex and very important question, existential question, I think, for India, that is Bharat. Because I do want the two to be similar, right? Unlike some who seem to profit from them being disparate. For India, that is Bharat, I would like to use a phrase that I can't remember who used it, it's not mine. Oh, yes, it was Rohit Invekar. I think it's very good. There are three actors involved in making this change. One in Hindi is called Samaj, which is society, which we often forget. The other is Sarkar, as you said. And the third is Bazar. Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazar have to come together to do three things. One, to create the policy space to remove barriers to this happening where it is not happening. Second, to change social attitudes to, and this is particularly important in education, to permit money to be spent in ways that it is not being spent today, being misallocated. That, I would say, is the primary responsibility of Samaj and the politician. And for Bazar, for capitalists, for entrepreneurs, to move away from making quick, low volume, high margin money, to move into the business of high value, low margin production. Because all the five things I speak of, the money making there comes from producing more at lower margins. If we can develop a political consensus between these three actors, this can happen. It is not anybody's fault, because Sarkar responds to Samaj and Bazar.
Okay.
So Samaj and Bazar will have to propose, and then Sarkar has to do its duty and make sure the extent conditions exist for that proposition to happen.
I understand what you're saying, but the truth is, not just in our country, but in all countries, Samaj and Bazar tend to respond to what I loosely call invisible hands. Forces that they can't identify, they cannot control, push them in a particular direction, and they begin to act as is the rational thing to do. But the Sarkar, on the other hand, can actually take steps that will encourage people to move in a particular direction. So let me ask you a specific question about Sarkar. To the extent the onus is on government to lead the way and provide incentives, what steps do you think the Modi government needs to take?
It's not just the Modi government. It's also
but talk about the Modi government. Don't start deflecting. Talk about the Modi government.
No. It's the Modi government and the state government. So I can tell you what the Modi government alone can do. And that is very important. It can answer some questions more honestly than it is doing at the moment. Such as, let me tell you something quite astounding, and I don't know the answer, but it is for government to find out, because it is vital to our existence. The state of Uttar Pradesh and the state of Tamil Nadu had roughly the same level of industrialization 40 years ago. Since then, Tamil Nadu has industrialized, but UP has deindustrialized. If you know Uttar Pradesh, which is both Modi government and Yogi government, outside, once you leave Ghaziabad, what you see is a terrain of deindustrialization that is equivalent to modern day United Kingdom. Whether it is Modinagar or Meerut or Muradabad Brassware or Agra shoes or Kanpur textiles or Allahabad batteries or Gorakhpur sugar and food processing, industry in UP has collapsed. What the government needs to do is find out why it has collapsed and what it can do to re-engineer or restart it. There are many such things it can do, but it would require them to cooperate with state governments. Now, the trouble with the Modi government, in my view, is that they are unwilling to move into cooperative federalism unless they get discernible credit for many of the things that they need to do collaboratively with state governments.
I understand that, but what is it that they need to do if they were willing to move into cooperative federalism? What are the concrete steps? Answering questions that even you don't have the answer to, no doubt they have to do. That will explain why UP has deindustrialized and why Tamil Nadu has become so industrial. But beyond answering that question, what concrete steps do they need to take to ensure that people begin to move towards producing the 5 items you've identified?
There's a different answer for each, but many of them lie well within the domain of the central government.
Briefly, what are the answers? Briefly, what are the answers?
Very briefly, in agriculture, implement doubling farmers' income properly as opposed to a slogan. There's an excellent report, which I was part of doing, which exists. It's not been implemented short of a slogan. And that has nothing to do with the farm laws. Implement it. It takes time, it will take effort, but implement it. With textiles, basically, this involves cooperation with state governments, come up with a systematic policy saying not that we will try, but we will foster entrepreneurship to build 300 rupee shirts, to make 300 rupee shirts
How will we
in North
foster
India.
entrepreneurship to do that?
But that is something that, again, as I said, the Sarkar can't do everything.
Should the government be giving tax incentives?
No, that won't do it, because that is not the reason people are not investing in
So what will do it?
What will do it is something the government will have to give me an idea on. I can discuss it. It has to do with law and order and governance.
Suggestions. Just name 3 suggestions.
No, you see, there are no other than changing your import policy, which should be part of the easy part of the solution. The basic problem is a governance problem. It's not a skills problem. All the people working in the shop floors of shirt factories in Gujarat and Tamil Nadu are, in fact, a good 20-25% are from North India. The question to ask is, why are they not being enabled to become entrepreneurs in North India? All right, this will take time and effort, but it certainly deserves policy attention.
Can I stop you there? The impression you're giving the audience is the following. You know what needs to be done to ensure that the next 200 million, 300 million become consumers and we don't get stuck in the middle income trap. You know what needs to be done, but you don't have a clear idea of how it should be done. You aren't.
I know the direction in which we need to move, but I have absolutely no clear. I don't have a buttoned up plan on how you would do it. I've identified the problem. It seems worthy of a solution. There are many things we can try. It needs other minds than me. It needs collaborative effort, but it certainly can be done because it has been done elsewhere. I have no concrete ideas on the third. On the fourth, I have a very depressing prognosis, but because that involves Samaj on education. But I have very concrete ideas on the third because it's relatively simple. The governments of India.
The third being affordable housing?
Yes. The biggest constraint to the price of housing is actually land availability in urban areas. The governments of India, but largely the central government, because of the army and the railways and the public sector, is the largest landowner in the country. It is therefore possible for the government to craft a land use policy that would have an end project, which is something like abolish slums in major metropolitan cities by using government land over time. They've taken the first step, I think, with the removal of cantonments. But now lots more needs to be done because there are several vested interests. It's not just the armed forces, it's also the railways.
So what you're saying, I'm trying to just focus your answer. You're saying that the government is sitting upon surplus land, railways, the army cantonments, public sector enterprises. This land can be used to help build affordable houses. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Commercial. Instead of giving subsidies and Abbas and land acquisition and all that, take this land, give it on 99-year leases, get developers to build things at a profit at 15%. Make sure that financial credit comes. Government owns the financial system in India, fortunately, to build 5 and 12 lakh properties with the land as collateral.
Let's look specifically at 2 examples that you briefly raised. First is to do with agriculture, which, as you said, employs between 46 and 47% of the population. The challenge is either to double the income of farmers or at least substantially increase farmers' incomes and thus help them consume things which so far have been beyond their reach. The question is, how do we do that? The government has been talking about doubling farmers' income since 2016 and it hasn't succeeded. It's 8 years and it hasn't succeeded. How do we, leave aside double, substantially increase farmers' incomes? Give me 2 or 3 steps that can be taken.
Sure. There is actually a report which the government has not seen fit to implement on doubling farmers' income. It's a very good report.
What's the report called?
It's called Doubling Farmers' Income, as far as I remember.
And you're saying if the government were to follow that report, farmers' incomes would double?
Well, as with most reports, they may not double, but certainly it would set you on the path to, as you say, substantially increasing farmers' income.
Okay. Beyond that, what are the other steps the government should take?
I think if you implemented that report, that would be sufficient. You'd have a challenge, of course. If you did implement that report, my feeling is that 47% of our population would not find employment in agriculture. The two don't match. And therefore, you have to simultaneously create employment elsewhere. So you have to do this along with providing opportunities in textiles, in housing, in health and education.
But you're fairly certain that if this report, the farmers' income report, as you call it, were to be implemented, even if farmers' income didn't double, they would substantially increase and the farmers would therefore be able to purchase things that are now beyond their reach. You're fairly certain of that?
Absolutely certain.
Okay. And how many years would it take? Are we talking about something that happened in a couple of years or 5 years or 10 years?
That entirely depends on the investment of political capital in the project. It can happen as quickly as 10 or as slowly as 25.
Okay, let's come to a second example, and it's one that you mentioned in this interview. You also wrote about it in your Economic Times article. As you said, we're very good at making shirts for the rich. For example, the 3,000 rupee pink shirt that you're wearing is made in India, as you pointed out. It's something that you can afford, but the rest of the country probably cannot. The problem is, despite a Make in India policy, reasonable quality, cheap shirts for the poor are not made in India. They're imported instead from Bangladesh and Vietnam. How do we ensure that those shirts, the shirts that the poor can buy, are made in India? How do we do that?
Well, I have to understand why people are not doing the logical thing. I'm an economist, so there's logical things people can do. And very often it goes beyond my ken.
What are the logical things? Identify them.
But the logical thing for you to do is to say that, okay, I know the reason why we're not producing 300 rupee shirts where we produce 3,000 rupee shirts. I've done the research. It's because wage rates in those geographies, Tirupur in Tamil Nadu and Vapi in Gujarat, are higher than the wage rates in Bangladesh.
Why not start making the shirts in UP and Bihar where wage rates are lower?
That's my ken. That's logical. Precisely.
Why
is it not happening?
How do you incentivize businessmen to start making shirts in UP and Bihar?
Well, for that, I have to answer the question, Karan, why is it that people are not following economic logic? And I get many answers from the lack of suitable kinship and caste network.
You're answering every question with a riddle. Why don't you give me a simple answer?
Because I don't have one. I have tried to research it, and the answer is not simple.
Encourage people to make cheap shirts in UP and Bihar?
Well, I can tell you that UP denationalized. That's a fact. I don't know why. And I suspect very strongly the answer as to why we are not making cheap shirts in UP at least is because we don't know why UP deindustrialized. Once we find that out, we can then understand how to get cheap shirts made in UP.
Okay, so the situation is a very interesting, if somewhat ironic situation. We know what we need to do. You spelled that out quite clearly. Unfortunately, we don't know how to do it because we don't know the answers to those unknown questions you're talking about. So we know what we have to do, but we don't know how to do it. And that's the quandary that we're stuck in.
It is. And I'll give you an interesting example. That's very true. At the sort of district magistrate level, some people did take the initiative in both Jharkhand and Bihar to set up these shirt factories. They worked for a while. And then for reasons that seem to be different for every factory, but they didn't go and look, they collapsed. So there's a systemic problem which we need to solve. I don't know what it is. I do need to speak to politicians. I need to speak to engineers. I need to speak to textile experts to see what the problem is. There are some other minor things we can do that I won't bore you with our import substitution policy on yarn and all that. But that by itself will not solve the problem. The problem is we have to understand why, despite low wages, people are unwilling, and reasonable infrastructure now, at least in UP, people are unwilling to invest in UP and Bihar.
Okay.
That's the core.
We're back to that quandary that I identified, which you completely agreed with. We know what the problem is, but we don't know for a variety of reasons what to do about it. Let's just assume we start producing what the 1.2 billion need and want to buy. How can we ensure that that 1.2 billion have the money to buy those things? Don't we simultaneously have a serious jobs and unemployment problem in India, which is suppressing income and demand? And unless people go into their pockets, we may be making things they want to buy, but they won't be able to afford them. How do we get over that?
That's the crux of the problem and the solution there. Who is going to make these things? It's not going to be people like me. It's not going to be the people who are going to work in semiconductor factories. It's going to be relatively lower skilled people with some upskilling at the margin who are going to, do better in agriculture, produce these 200 rupee shirts, improve the quality and range of education industry, build those houses. But look, all these industries, construction, primary and basic education, primary and frontline health, 200 rupee shirts, agriculture, do not require high technology, high education. So it is quite, and if they're put in the geographies where you have high unemployment, high deprivation, and high poverty, if those geographies lead, and they will because the market is there, because the people are there, right? Then automatically there'll be a link between these things being produced. unless we get the Chinese to produce them for us.
So what you're
and
saying,
people being able to
forgive
buy
me
them.
interrupting, but what you're saying is if we start producing these 5 things in the geographies where they're needed, where the poor live, you'll be creating jobs for those very people because you're now producing and investing there. In other words, the second you invest and produce there, you'll be creating jobs. The second you create jobs, you'll be putting income into their pockets. And the second you put income into their pockets, they'll be able to buy what you're producing. There'll be a virtuous circle, in other words.
Absolutely. And therefore, before the election, I did tell the combined opposition, actually, because they asked me, I said, if you want a slogan and you want an economic strategy, you may not, because the country doesn't vote on economics anymore. Then it's very simple in Hindi. Jahan ghar, wahi naukri.
Okay. Now, India's demographic dividend won't last for more than the next 15, 20 years. Meanwhile, the average age of the population is steadily increasing. It was roughly 17 in the 70s. It's now 28, 29. So how much time do we have to do what you think is essential before it becomes too late? In other words, how many years do we have before it's unavoidable that we are stuck in the middle income trap?
I can give you a very precise answer to that. We will know that we are in a middle income trap in 5 to 10 years, I would say. But let me take your very helpful demographic and aging problem and show you how this is where economists is marginally useful, because we like making money. So how do I, and this is a global problem actually. So think of the world at large. What's the global economic problem? The global economic problem is, and it replicates in India, a bunch of old people living in Europe and Japan have the money, have the savings, have the wealth, but they don't have young people to work for them and give them services which they can buy. The young people don't live in Europe and Japan, they live in India and they live in Africa. Now, the old people don't want the young people to come in untrammeled quantities to where they live. So they have a very simple choice globally. They can either invest in India and Africa and buy the services they need to live their lovely lives, right? Or they can let Indians and Africans come to where they live. India has the same problem. We're going to have an old population by, I would say, 20, 25 years. It had better be the case that the majority of this population is substantially richer than the younger population that we have then. Then there will be money to be made. High value services at high wages will be delivered by younger people for old people, which is why healthcare becomes such an important industry.
So what's the answer to my question? How many years do we have
25.
before it becomes too late?
Oh, too late, 10 years. You have to start preparing for this in the next 10 years and implementing stuff. In 25 years, the transformation should be complete.
In other words, 10 years to start doing what you think we need to do, and 20...
No. 10 years to finish doing all the things that we identify in the next 2 years we need to do. They'll take, for example, farmers' income. They'll take about 10 years to implement its substantial measure.
So hang on, I'm interrupting because I don't want to get lost in details.
Sure.
2 years to do what you think we need to do, 10 years to fully implement it, to take the example of increasing farmers' income, and then 20 years, perhaps beyond that, to realize the results.
Yes, that is what development transformation looks like. Absolutely.
Okay, my last question. You were a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council during the first Modi government right up till 2019. Have you shared your thinking with the government? That's the first question. And then if you have, what sort of response did you get? But give me brief answers to both.
To quote a very famous Indian politician, our chronology subject. So around 6 months before the 2019 election, we were asked in the Prime Minister's Council to present our ideas for the next 5 years. I presented 3 ideas, but the principal one I presented was the one of a middle income trap and my ideas on what to do about it. I then spoke about it to media when it was clear to me by March, just before the election, that nothing was happening. I was then actually summoned by those in power, not the politicians, the civil servants, to explain myself. And I said, when I gave you this report, and they looked at me blankly. And then there was some waffle and they went away. That's all I have to say.
You mean to say you submitted a report? When they asked you to explain yourself, you said, I've submitted a report. They looked at you blankly.
I submitted the report.
Let me finish. Does that mean they hadn't read the report or hadn't understood the report? Which of the two?
I don't know. They never told me. Could be either or both. Well, it couldn't be both. Could be either. So I submitted a report in November 2018. I hear nothing till March. Election is announced. I go on television, not your channel, and I speak of this middle income trap. I'm then summoned to ask why I spoke about it. I said, I gave you a report in November. That's all I knew.
In other words, they haven't asked any further questions.
No, there was no comeback at all. Nobody asked me.
And they've shown
anything else.
as a result, no great interest at all in the fear that you were identifying.
Yeah, I guess so. Maybe they thought I was stupid or wrong. Their privilege.
All right, Mr. Roy. This is a very depressing note on which to end if you're correct. The prospect that looms and might actually happen as well is that India could get stuck in a middle income trap forever. It might never become a developed high income country. And worst it, as you explained, that could have awful implications for what you call the integrity and unity of the country. You submitted a report on this, explaining the situation to the government. You've had no credible comeback other than to look you blankly in the face. And you don't even know whether they read the report or if they did, whether they understood it. That is a truly depressing note on which to end, but I thank you for having explained things to me so fully. Take care, stay safe.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.